Should be good to go, Brian.
All right, thank you, Shannon. So again, this is Certified Planner Environmental Evaluation webinar number 3 of 3. So yay, we've made it to this point. As a reminder, if you have questions on any of the special environmental concerns that we've gone over in today or the past 3 weeks, definitely follow the chain of command as we always do, and it can be elevated to the area office or to us here at the state office as needed. We know that there can be questions at these. Some of these are tricky topics, and it is definitely the case that your time is worth more than spending half a day trying to search for some of this. And having spent some time researching some of these topics, we know it can be quite the rabbit trail to find out all the details. So definitely ask the questions if you have them. Today, we're going to be covering, as we said, an expansive number of topics in a very short period of time. This is possible to some extent because a few of these have little or nearly zero applicability to Indiana. However, we are touching upon them because 1, it is important to understand the scope of what this agency does at a national level, and 2, you may choose to take positions in states that have some of these special environmental concerns. We hope not. We hope you stay here, but we do know that some individuals go elsewhere. So definitely it's important to know that these are out there. I would highly recommend for a few of these that you do watch the environmental evaluation series should you go to a state where it's a more prominent concern, because we are going to just hit the highlights of a few of these. So speaking of potentially not having any impact here in Indiana, let's have a quick pop quiz to see who is ready with the coffee this morning. True or false? There are no coral reefs associated with the lower 48 states. All right, the answers are coming in, and that is false. And perhaps some of you have been to these locations. The Dry Tortugas and Biscayne Bay National Parks in Florida offer opportunities to explore coral reefs. Florida's coral reefs represent the 3rd largest barrier reef ecosystem in the world. The Florida Reef Tract extends from St. Lucie Inlet in Martin County, north of Miami, to the Dry Tortugas west of the Florida Keys. Roughly 2/3 of the Florida Reef Tract lie within Biscayne National Park and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. All this being said, the list of coral jurisdictions shown here unsurprisingly does not list Indiana. So this is not applicable on the CPA 52. Now, as a refresher, what does give NRCS the authority to even consider coral reefs during the planning process? This is just a memory jog. Try to sneakily, while there's a pretty picture on the screen, remember some of the things from the previous 2 sessions. So does anyone remember what it is that gives us the authority to consider any of these special environmental concerns? Hopefully, as you're thinking about it, you remember that as employees of the executive branch, our authorities come from the pyramid of laws, regulations, and policy. NRCS's authority regarding coral reefs as a special environmental concern comes from Executive Order 13089, issued in 1998. And remember that for agency business, the executive orders carry the force and effect of law. The executive order created a coral reef task force with 11 federal agencies as members, including the USDA. NRCS staff have even participated on this task force or been members of local working groups. There are a whole host of other laws and environmental concerns that apply to coral reefs, including obviously NEPA, which allows us to put this on the CPA 52, and also the 3rd law you see here, the Magnuson-Stevenson's Fishery Conservation and Management Act, which leads into the next special environmental concern we're going to cover here today, the essential fish habitat. The Magnuson-Stevenson Act provides for the conservation and management of the nation's fishery resources through the preparation and implementation.
Here we can sit and meet here and talk about the programs a little bit more.
Thank you. The Magnuson-Stevenson Act provides for the conservation and management of the nation's fishery resources through the preparation and implementation of a fishery management plan. Most of the focus is on highly migratory species, species which dwell on or in the continental shelf of the US, and anadromous species of fish which utilize our streams and rivers for spawning. An anadromous fish is a fish born in freshwater, spends most of its life in the sea, and returns to freshwater to spawn. Salmon, smelt, shad, striped bass, and sturgeon are all common examples. So this is just a sort of fun trivia as our next question. What is the example of a catadromous fish? So we talked about the law covering the anadromous fish, but what would be a catadromous fish? Does anyone know? Or an example of one? This is can use this as a fun fact for next game of Trivial Pursuit. I see Randy has answered. The American eel. The American eel is a catadromous fish. It lives in fresh or brackish water during its adult life, then migrates to the ocean to spawn. The American eel adults die after spawning, like many of our anadromous fish do as well. So whether it is an eel or a salmon, lobster in coastal Maine, abalone in California, crawfish in Louisiana, essential fish habitat is a crucial part of local communities and culturally significant to the heritage of many indigenous cultures. Essential fish habitat means those waters and substrate necessary for fish spawning, breeding, feeding, or growth to maturity. The term fish means finfish, mollusks, crustaceans, and all other forms of marine animal and plant life other than marine mammals and birds. Unlike the Endangered Species Act, the essential fish habitat regulations are only related to adverse effects and how to avoid them. If you recall, even with the Endangered Species Act, if there is the potential to affect with a benefit, we still must consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Nrcs will work with the local fishery management authorities to identify if there are potential negative effects. And how do we find out if there's a local essential fish habitat council? Fortunately, there is an online database which is housed by NOAA. The internet search will take you right to it. You can select which of the councils you are interested in exploring and zoom in. However, note, Indiana is not covered by a council, so this too, like coral reefs, is not applicable. So why am I dragging you through a number of coastal laws when Indiana is an interior state? Because as you may or may not know, we are in fact a coastal state. And while you may not have been to a coral reef, you may have been to Indiana dunes. The U.S. Congress recognized the importance of meeting the challenge of continued growth in the coastal zone by passing the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972. The objective of coastal zone management areas are to preserve, protect, develop, and where possible to restore or enhance the resources of the nation's coastal zone, collectively known as coastal states. It is administered by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or as mentioned in the previous slide, NOAA. So which Indiana counties are part of a coastal zone management area? Looks to me that everyone was just waiting for this question to pop up. We got responses pretty quickly. And you are correct. Lovingly known as the region, Lake Porter and LaPorte counties fall within the Indiana Coastal Management Zone. We do have a website on the state DNR webpage. The Lake Michigan Coastal Program provides guidance, technical support, and some financial assistance to municipal, county, and state government agencies which are working within the coastal region. The coastal region of Northwest Indiana roughly consists of the northern half of Lake Porter and LaPorte counties, as most people in the chat mentioned. Work done in partnership with the Lake Michigan Coastal Program must further the mission of the program, which is to protect and enhance natural, cultural, and historic coastal resources, and to foster coordination and partnerships among local, state, and federal agencies and local organizations. Funding and oversight are provided through NOAA's Office of Coastal Management. So some examples of what the Lake Michigan Coastal Program wants to focus on are the protection and restoration of those significant natural and cultural resources, prevent the loss of life and property in the coastal hazard areas, improve public access for recreational purposes, revitalize urban waterfronts and ports, improve coordination among government and local agencies and the decision-making process, and pollution prevention initiatives in that area. Boundaries of the coastal management zones are defined by those states. Some states use ordinary high water marks or other topographic lines. An example of this is Michigan. Some identify specific counties or portions thereof, and some use other qualifiers such as counties with economies closely tied with coastal resources. Some take a tiered approach based on the location. Indiana's coastal zone is based on watershed boundaries within the coastal townships of the 3 counties mentioned earlier to create an inland boundary that is identifiable in practical landmarks. The coastal zone boundary is described based on the U.S. Geological Survey quadrangle maps and major roads for each of these counties. The coastal zone boundary is located in the northern portions of Lake Porter and LaPorte. At its widest extent, it is 17 miles or to Crown Point area, and at its narrowest point, it's less than 2 miles, just north of Hudson Lake and LaPorte County. Again, you can see this map on the DNR webpage as well as the NOAA Lake Michigan Coastal Program webpage. Federal agency activities, including those funded or assisted by federal agencies, must be consistent with the coastal management plan to the maximum extent possible. The plan explicitly defines activities that need federal consistency as enforceable policies to provide the legal criteria to determine consistency. Of course, this is all a bunch of legalese, and it can be kind of complicated to explain, but basically for activities needing federal permits, such as Clean Water Act 402 or 404, a separate consistency document isn't needed. So if those kinds of activities are happening on our projects, there is no further other action needed with the Indiana Coastal Zone. Those will cover this. There are a few other activities proposed that are not subject to permit, and these are subject to consistency requirements. So what does this mean? It means that we just need to be considering those things that could impact the coastal zone. And for us, this really is the erosion risk and sedimentation risks, potential pesticide runoff, and responses really to any of the other environmental concerns. What you see on the screen here is actually Indiana's guidance in terms of the coastal zone, as well as our Environmental Policy Act, which guides a lot of the coastal zone management here. It includes the fulfilling of the responsibilities to examine all the special environmental concerns that relate to Indiana, as well as to our NEPA. And again, if we are not creating an environmental concern through the actions, then we are likely consistent with this coastal zone management. Of course, this only impacts a handful of you. So for many of you, as with the other 2 resource concerns we just listed, this is going to be not applicable. But in those areas where this is a potential applicability, 1, many of those are highly developed in urban areas and we may not be working much in them anyway. But 2, if we're reducing erosion risk, reducing sedimentation risk into the lake, and any other type of efforts that we put in that would reduce any kind of runoff or drift or anything else is really going to be of benefit to this coastal zone management and can be marked as a positive effect. Moving from coastal areas to more broad concerns and jumping into one of the most broad ones we have, invasive species. And these 2 topics are not unrelated. Anyone who has spent time in the Lake Michigan coastline knows Phragmites is everywhere, closely followed by purple loosestrife and reed canary grass. And then of course there is a myriad of other species that we are impacted by here in Indiana, including those like this field of Palmer amaranth or a wooded trail of stiltgrass. So as a special environmental environmental concern, invasive species are definitely near the top, and it hopefully goes without saying why we are so concerned about them. As you can see from the information on the slide, invasive species have caused a heavy economic burden from both direct and indirect effects. They have had negative effects upon our native species, particularly our threatened and endangered species, and they have greatly reduced available forage for livestock, having affected fire frequencies and dramatically altered many landscapes. There is a long list of authorities that guide our actions as they relate to invasive species. Highlighted here, NEPA, the Food Security Act, and the Invasive Species Executive Order are three of the key ones that we are often dealing with. And also there is policy within the general manual related to invasive species. One may encounter a variety of terms often associated with the concept of invasive species, a few of which are identified here. The terms in yellow are those which we in Nrcs usually deal with. A noxious weed are those plants designated as such by the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Interior, or by the Indiana Office of the State Chemist. Here are a list of the plants that should be controlled as part of this noxious weed law. And you may have heard that amaranth was recently added, and it was, but it relates to the seed, not the plants themselves. The list of prohibited seeds is far more extensive than the list of plants, and even more extensive when restricted seed is included as well, which is not shown here. For the purposes of what we're dealing with in the field and seeing plants, the state noxious plants are legally required to be controlled. The state seed is managed by the State Office of the Chemist when they are looking at seed tags and seeing what is in seed mixes. When we discuss non-native species, these relate to a particular ecosystem and any species that is not native to that ecosystem. Not all non-native species are invasive or noxious. However, non-native species pose a higher likelihood of becoming invasive or noxious, potentially degrading the ecosystem. Steps should be taken to prevent the introduction of known or unknown non-native species to an area without prior knowledge of potential implications to the ecosystem. Introduced species connotates an intentional introduction of a species. We use introduced grasses for pasture, critical area plantings, and grassed waterways all the time. Not all introduced species create long-term problems. And the term naturalized are those species that were introduced but have escaped cultivation in horticultural areas and are now part of a local ecosystem. Examples include dandelion, plantain, clovers, chicories, etc. In some instances, they may become invasive. In others, they're limited to disturbed areas and rarely creep far into native systems or do not exclude other species. So our pop quiz is going to be on this slide. And what is the invasive species shown here? Well, this was a bit of a trick question. Most everyone sees the calorie pear or the white flowered tree in the background, but the green up front is actually bush honeysuckle. So definitely two of our most prominent invasive species out there. For invasive species, the definition in use by most federal agencies is the one used in Executive Order 13112, Invasive Species of 1999, which states that an invasive species is an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Notice that in this definition, the species labeled as invasive must be 1, not native to a particular ecosystem, and 2, one that is causing or is likely causing harm. Being non-native to a particular ecosystem alone does not mean the invasive species is, it does not mean that the species is invasive. In other words, non-native does not equal invasive. In fact, non-native crops, livestock, including soybeans, wheat, and cattle, form the foundations of U.S. agriculture, and other exotic species play key roles in the pet and nursery industries and in biological control efforts. Here in Indiana, our landscape hostas do not escape out from our front flower beds, But it's also important to note that what is not invasive in one location may be in another. An example of this is actually the butterfly bush. This may be a horticultural species you have in your own landscaping, and if you're like me, you have had trouble keeping it alive. But in other parts of the country and even this state, it is actually spreading into natural ecosystems, particularly riparian areas. And it should be noted that although it attracts butterflies, it has very little nutritive value for the butterflies. It's essentially attracting kids to a snow cone machine. Lots of colors and flavor, very little health value. And the reason I've just flat out given up even trying. But it is becoming problematic in many states across the nation and has been added to many states' invasive species lists. The executive order, as we provided earlier, defines terms associated with invasive species. It also identifies the duties of all federal agencies whose actions may affect the status of invasive species. It requires all federal agencies to identify these actions and to use the appropriate programs and authorities to 1, prevent introductions of invasive species, 2, to detect and respond rapidly to the control of populations in a cost-effective and environmentally sound manner, and 3, monitor populations, 4, provide for the restoration of native species and habitat conditions, 5, to conduct research and develop technologies to prevent the introduction and to provide for environmentally sound control, and 6, to promote public education on invasive species and how to address them. Next pop quiz, what is the species shown on this page? Fantastic, everyone seems to be getting this one, and it is the burning bush. And ironically, this particular image came from a site that was a website that implied they only sold native plants. So again, being cautious of where we source our materials. In addition, the executive order directs federal agencies to do no harm, creates the National Invasive Species Council, charges the Department of Interior with chartering the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, and requires the preparation of a National Invasive Species Management Plan. In being consistent with the requirements of the executive order and adhering to the goals of the National Invasive Species Management Plan, NRCS employees are to incorporate the identification and control of invasive species into agency planning process. Also, we will not support or engage in actions we believe are likely to promote the introduction or spread of invasive species. In other words, we will do no harm. Additionally, NRCS roles in regard to invasive species are that we will utilize appropriate conservation programs to work in compliance with all national, tribal, state, and local laws, mindful of the environmental, social, cultural, and economic impacts of our technical and financial assistance that we provide as it relates to invasive species. We are aware that as our field offices work directly with landowners and their properties, NRCS may be the first to recognize the presence of invasive species and the opportunity for early response. Our policy voices a preference for the use of native species in our restoration activities, if native species will support the conservation need, and if not, recommending the use of appropriate non-native species or non-native, non-invasive vegetation is the most beneficial course of action. We will provide for the preparation of appropriate control plans, technical notes, and guides. And the NRCS plant material centers do research and publish technical information and guidance about the restoration and make regionally specific plant recommendations. And as we have already discussed, our policy reiterates the importance of partnerships at many levels in order to successfully address invasive species. Here in Indiana, I'm sure everyone is quite familiar with many of our partners that work with us on invasive species, from SICM, the Indiana Invasive Species Council, the Indiana Invasive Initiative, the Nature Conservancy, and all of the various county cooperative invasive management areas. The Indiana Invasive Species Council was established by the state legislature to enhance the ability of the government agencies to detect, prevent, monitor, and manage new and long-established invasions, as well as increase public awareness about invasive species. Also of note, as it relates to invasive species, while the national executive order does apply to both plants and animals, NRCS focuses its efforts on the plant side of this. groups, agencies such as APHIS tend to take the lead on the animals. So with all of this, what should we be documenting? First and foremost, we should be documenting the presence of invasive species and identifying what the impacts of conservation alternatives will have. When invasive control is part of the plan, that should be documented as well, and we know that can happen through 314 brush management and 315 herbaceous weed control. Finally, as an agency, at the very, very minimum, we should not be making the situation worse. We should not be vectors for these species. Biology note, technical note number 9, references the biosecurity procedures we should be observing to prevent the spread of plant pests. And now for the final topic that I will cover today, wetlands. NEPA requires the federal agencies to integrate environmental considerations into their decision-making process, and specifically mentions wetlands as a required consideration, which means it is a required part of our planning process and the CPA 52. It applies to all NRCS-assisted programs, both financial and technical assistance. As with every other environmental concern we discussed, we are starting with the authorities. Of course, there's NEPA, as I just mentioned. Then there is Executive Order 11990, which states each agency shall provide leadership and shall take action to minimize the destruction, loss of wetlands, and to preserve and enhance the natural beneficial values of wetlands in carrying out the agency's responsibilities for acquiring, managing, or disposing of federal lands and facilities, for providing federally undertaken, financed, or assisted construction and improvements, and conducting federal activities and programs affecting land use, including but not limited to water and related land resource planning, regulating, licensing, and activities. So that's a lot in a single sentence describing the executive order, but the long and short of it is if we are providing or taking a federal action that impacts the land, which we always are, then we need to take into considerations wetlands. Also applicable is the Clean Water Act, and stay tuned for more information on that. So wetland compliance provisions versus wetland protection policy. For wetland compliance, I recommend checking out Al's webinar from the Certified Conservation Planner, Fundamentals of Highly Erodible Land and Wetland Conservation Provisions. The reason for this is the wetland conservation or swamp buster provisions are not specific to our agency actions. We are looking at the wetland protection policy, which is not specific to the actions the farmer or landowner is taking on their land, but how it impacts their eligibility and how it impacts their eligibility, but what steps we are taking. So wetland conservation and swamp buster is really about the landowner and their eligibility, where wetland protection policy is about our actions as it relates to the wetland. What this also means is that a wetland inventory will suffice, and a certified wetland determination is not necessarily required when we are taking into account the wetland protection policy. So how do we complete a wetland inventory that is sufficient for identifying wetlands subject to the wetland protection policy? Well, let's take our next pop quiz. What are the factors used to define a wetland? Fantastic. Hopefully none of these factors is surprising, and it doesn't appear to be so. Hydrology, hydric soil, and hydrophytic vegetation. Other approved methods for helping with this process include using the Wetlands of the United States, Circular 39, the classification of wetlands and deep water habitats in the United States, or the Cowardin method. The Army Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual can be used, but is not required. And the Food Security Act wetland identification procedures can also be used, but are also, again, not required. Any of these methods can be used. Soil mapping and hydric soils list, the National Wetland Inventory, the Soil Survey Water Features Report, USGS topo quads, ecological site descriptions, aerial imagery interpretation, field verification. All of these are methods that can be used to identify wetlands for the purposes of wetland protection policy. Again, wetland protection policy and wetland as it relates to Swamp Buster are two different paths. If the environmental evaluation finds that wetlands will be affected, the following mitigation sequence is followed because NRCS will consider the protection of wetland functions to the maximum extent practicable when implementing planning and program activities. And this can be found, and this guidance is found in the general manual. So if we think there may be a potential impact of what we are proposing as alternatives on a wetland, there's some things we can do. First is avoidance. If practicable, alternatives exist that avoid adverse impacts to a wetland, the clients must choose the alternative that is not going to have any adverse effects, or NRCS will terminate all assistance that is if this is not possible. So if the client chooses to still take an action that will have an adverse effect on a wetland, then we must terminate our assistance, especially if there is an alternative that is practicable that would avoid it. But if there are no ways to avoid it, if there are measures exist that at least minimize the adverse effects to the wetlands, the clients must choose to implement measures that will minimize those impacts, or again, NRCS will terminate all assistance. Again, we need to take that minimal effect. And finally, if the client wishes to pursue an option that will result in adverse impacts of the wetland, compensation for the loss of wetland acres and functions is required, and this is if there is no other option. NRCS may assist the client in the development of the mitigation plan, but again, note the willingness to provide compensation or to build a wetland somewhere else does not relieve the avoidance and minimization requirements. This is the path of last resort. And of course, when we start talking about the alteration of wetlands, potential impact, even if we get into the route of minimization or compensation, then we could be talking about a whole host of other considerations, such as the Clean Water Act and permitting. And with that, that's going to be a lead in to the next part of our presentation. So with that, I'm going to take space for questions, and we're going to switch over to Stephen.
If you don't get any questions, Brianne, we can take a 5-minute break and
Right.
start back up at 10:10.
5-minute break, everyone.
Well, welcome back, everyone. This is Stephen Ball, Cultural Resource Specialist at the State Office. And as a segue from Brianne talking about wetlands, we're going to be talking about the Clean Water Act, which is another thing on the CPA 52. And, you know, being an archaeologist, you want to know what the antecedents or ancestry of all these laws are. And the Clean Water Act legislation was not just the result of the reaction to the catching fire in 1969 over in Ohio, or any of the various ecological disasters in the early 1970s. There were a whole series of laws that were passed over the last 100 years regulating water pollution in the US. And one result of this kind of sporadic legislation is you had a hodgepodge of laws covering water quality in the US. So to solve the problems in 1972, there were amendments made to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which actually dates all the way back to 1948. And it restructured the authority for water pollution control and consolidated authority in the administration of the Environmental Protection Agency. The purpose of the act, or the purposes of the act, are to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Nrcs water quality policy derives from the USDA departmental regulations and the general manual, as you can see here. Now, the Clean Water Act has many parts, many sections, and these are the four that apply mostly to the NRCS, but the primary ones that we deal with are Section 404, dredge and fill permits, and Section 401, which are state water quality certifications. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act regulates the discharge of dredged or fill material into the waters of the U.S. And this is the section that is invoked by many of our engineering practices when we're working on floodplains or near wetlands. And if you're doing this and you're going to be discharging it in dredged material, you're going to need a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. And this is applied when you're working within the waters of the United States, which leads to the loaded question, what are the waters of the United States? And you would think that would be self-explanatory, and you would be wrong. So the waters of the U.S. include the territorial seas, TNWs, which are traditionally navigable waters, all interstate waters, including wetlands, and then you go to interstate waters, tributaries, the jurisdictional waters listed above, impoundments of jurisdictional waters, and wetlands adjacent to jurisdictional waters. And it's the first three on this list are generally agreed upon, but when you get into isolated wetlands and water bodies, that's when it tends to get fractious. And we all know the definition of what are waters of the U.S. has been changed, litigated, and changed again over the past three, and of course, now 4 administrations. So rather than reviewing all this, I'm going to refer you to the latest EPA presentation, dates to July 7th, 2020, on the definition of the waters of the U.S. But I want to warn you, this presentation that a reference is about the same length as the entire presentation we're giving you this morning. So if you have more interest in what are considered the waters of the U.S. at this point in time, I'm recommending accessing the EPA site. But to summarize, when you're planning practices on waters of the U.S. that have potential to discharge dredged or fill material, then the Clean Water Act Section 404 applies, and the need for permitting applies. So geographic features that are generally not considered part of the waters of the United States, swales, erosional features, gullies, small washes characterized by low volume, infrequent, and short duration flow, farm ponds, not impoundments. Ditches are not, but the definition of ditch does not include a channelized stream. So if you have a drainage ditch that you're working near, and it is actually what was once an ephemeral stream that was channelized and then connects into one of the waters of the U.S., that is usually considered part of the waters of the U.S. So water is lacking a significant nexus where one is required for Clean Water Act jurisdiction also is not considered waters of the U.S. Unfortunately, these geographic features are where we do most of our work. But many of our engineering practices do result in the discharge of dredged or fill material. I mean, stream bank stabilization when you're using riprap is considered a discharge of fill or dredged material. Mechanized land clearing, water control structures, and of course, wetlands. So wetland restoration when you're involving excavation is also covered by Section 404. The next few slides were lifted directly from Scott Wagner's ICP training on wetlands because many of his points are directly applicable to Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, as well as the floodplain and riparian areas that we're going to be talking about later. So, wetland restoration activities or other activities that invoke Section 404 are subject to various federal, state, and sometimes local regulatory programs, all of which have the intent of protecting natural resources and the integrity of the nation's water resources. Now, each of these regulatory agencies have their own set of laws and regulation that they are trying to implement to the best of their ability. So it's early coordination with these regulatory agencies is most important when you're basically invoking Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So who regulates where? And this is a very nice diagram showing the where and who as regulatory oversight. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has oversight over waters of the United States, intermittent perennial streams and wetlands adjacent to them. Within Indiana, IDAM also claims regulatory oversight over waters of the U.S. and isolated wetlands. And DNR has oversight over floodways with more than 1 square mile of drainage and includes streams, wetlands, and trees found within. So there are a lot of regulatory hoops to go through if you are invoking Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and you're resulting in the discharge of fill or dredged material into the waters of the U.S. And this diagram highlights activities that are typically regulated. And I mean, it looks kind of discouraging, but the laws and regulations these agencies are following try to capture a really large swath of activities. And many of these activities may have exemptions or merely just notifying the agency is sufficient. So for the planner, what is most important is you have to loop in the area engineer early in the process if you will be impacting waters of the United States, and that is extremely important. And just looking at these practices here, it's good to focus on it because when we get into riparian areas and floodplain management, they're also going to be covered by Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So that brief discussion of the Clean Water Act segues directly into floodplain and riparian areas, which are both considered special environmental concerns, along with being covered by the Clean Water Act. So floodplains are also covered by Executive Order 11988 on floodplain management, which states to conserve, preserve, and restore existing natural and beneficial values in base floodplains as part of the technical and financial assistance the program is administers. So we're required to reduce the risk of flood loss, minimize the impact of floods on human health, safety, and welfare, and restore and preserve the natural and beneficial values served by floodplains. Our policy on that is outlined in the general manual, and needless to say, floodplains are also covered by the Clean Water Act. So just a general, I mean, everybody on this, call should be familiar with what a floodplain is, but this is a nice cross section showing you the various parts of the floodplain. The Nrcs definition for floodplain is basically areas with a 1% chance of being flooded in any given year. I mean, quite often referred to as the 100-year return interval on a base floodplain. There are also critical action floodplains, which are defined as the 500-year floodplain, where there is the presence of a facility such as a school, hospital, nursing home, utility, or facility providing volatile, toxic, or water-reactive materials. Riparian areas are basically ecotones that occur along watercourses or water bodies. And NRCS assistance in this is really helping land users make sound resource management decisions about the riparian area. And NRCS must strive to provide the best alternatives for the proper use and management of these important natural resources. So as you can see in the picture, the riparian area is the area that is along the watercourse. And they are distinctly different from the surrounding lands because of unique soil and vegetation characteristics that are strongly influenced by the nearness to the unbound water in the river or the lake. Riparian ecotones occupy the transitional area between the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And typical examples of this would include perennial and intermittent stream banks, floodplains, and lake shores. Now for riparian and floodplains, you look at the respective laws and you can see all the regulation and policy is on the floodplain side of the of our policies. So riparian areas are not enforced by any particular law. It is strictly NRCS policy that dealing with any negative impacts to the floodplains or the riparian areas should be avoided. So not really an important distinction, but it is something that you do. So if in the environmental evaluation you find that floodplains or riparian areas are going to be infected, you have a mitigation sequence similar to what Brianne discussed for wetlands. First is avoiding the impact altogether by not taking certain actions or parts of an action, minimizing impacts by limiting the degree or magnitude of the action and its implementation, rectifying the impact by repairing, rehabilitation, restoring the affected environment, reducing or eliminating the impact, and in the end, if you go through with the compensating for the impact to floodplains or riparian areas. So, pop quiz. Are there any Indiana-specific policies on riparian areas? So this is not a matter of national policy. Are there Indiana state-specific policies on riparian areas and dealing with them? Okay, I got one yes. Anybody know what the Indiana policy references? Because you're right. Well, we have two yeses. The state-specific policy is about woody vegetation removal in riparian areas, and this is a fairly old one. I think it was with the agency when this came out, but just looking at practices in riparian areas that will disturb less than 100 linear feet versus practices in riparian areas that will disturb greater than 100 linear feet. And again, this is state-specific policy. Right, and Morgan brings up the Rule 5 in construction. We may deal with riparian areas in terms of construction. And Mr. Torp brings up when we have EWP, when removing log jams, and you have to access it through going into the floodplain. When you remove that log jam, you can't dump the log jam onto the floodplain itself. So this is just brief for questions because the Clean Water Act, Wetlands, Section 404 or 401, floodplains and riparian areas all have these kind of overlapping things that restrict what we can do and what we can suggest for them. And since I have 10 minutes left, I think I'll move on to the final things that I'll be talking about. And that is the Clean Air Act. Now, the Clean Air Act establishes air quality criteria for investigating pollutants relative to their adverse effects on human health and welfare. Within nationwide, there are two clean air related special environmental concerns. One is criteria pollutants, and the other is regional visibility degradation, which most people probably have not heard of. Now, in Indiana, the main criteria pollutants we deal with are particulate matter and ozone. Now, regional visibility degradation is associated with nearness to national parks and national wilderness areas that are classified as Class 1 areas on a national level. Now, the good news, there are no mandatory Class 1 areas within 50 miles of the Indiana border, and that's the required proximity to be considered under that section of the Clean Air Act. Now, honestly, I don't know what will happen with Indiana Dunes becoming the 61st National Park back in 2019. But as of today, it is not listed nationally as a Class 1 area. So if it does get listed as a Class 1 area, then anybody within 50 miles of the Indiana Dunes would have to be more aware of the protections that are added for regional visibility degradation. But for the moment, there are no mandatory Class 1 areas within 50 miles of the Indiana border. Closest one really is Mammoth Cave down in Kentucky. The partially good news is that 98% in Indiana is not classified as a non-attainment zone under the Clean Air Act. So non-attainment zones are those areas that are sufficiently impaired by air pollution to be covered by the requirements of the Clean Air Act. So under the Clean Air Act, the agricultural producer has the ultimate responsibility for complying with any applicable air quality requirements. And it's our responsibility to help point them in the right direction on this. So can anyone name the counties covered by the Clean Air Act? I've got Lake and Porter. All of them is not right. Lake and Porter, Lake. Yeah, it's similar to having a coastal zone, right? So Lake and Porter counties, basically, we can think of as suburban Chicago, right? But also there's a section of Dearborn County adjacent to metropolitan Cincinnati that is also covered. So if you're in Indiana, accepting Porter, Lake, and parts of Dearborn, you're fine. The Clean Air Act is not considered applicable. There is an unattainment area for lead around Muncie, Indiana. And actually one of these days I'll have to look into what the historical process for it was for Muncie being listed so heavily for lead pollution. But since our practices don't tend to increase the release of lead into the air, we can ignore that one as well. Jennifer Chen suggests glass. So I don't know anybody from the Muncie area knows the traditional industry that caused Muncie to be so high in that particular element. You know, I'd like to hear about it. Oh, ball jars, Jenny Helt says. So could very possibly be the ball factory, which I am unfortunately not related to. So the Clean Air Act Authority Section 176 of the Clean Air Act prohibits federal activity in a non-attainment area that does not conform to SIP requirements. And agricultural operations and sources are not exempt from the Clean Air Act. NRCS policy on this can be found in Section 610.21 on air quality in the Clean Air Act. So what does this mean for people in Lake and Porter County and in that section of Dearborn County? So the steps you want to take in a non-attainment zone, you probably want to be very careful of recommending practices that may increase emissions of nitrogen oxide or volatile organic compounds, because this is where ozone comes from, as well as dust and other particles. So the criteria pollutants, this is, very seldom are we going to be recommending practices that are going to increase pollution, whether it's emphasizing no-till or replacing a diesel pump in an irrigation system with a more efficient diesel pump. In general, we're improving. Most of the practices we have improve the quality of air. But if you are working in a non-attainment zone, this is something that you have to address. And planners in a non-attainment zone area, you always have to include an alternative in the CPA 52 that decreases the emission of a regulated air pollutant. It may not be the alternative that the landowner chooses, and the landowner is ultimately responsible for adherence to the Clean Air Act, but it has to be included as an alternative in the CPA 52. And now my favorite, environmental justice. It's kind of funny, it was almost a coin toss between Brianne and I, as to who got coral reefs and who got environmental justice. Because if you got coral reefs, you got to be able to show a bunch of pretty pictures people would like, and you would then inform everybody this would have no impact on their planning. Versus looking at environmental justice, which is a very broad category and is really hard to incorporate in any kind of step-by-step way in your planning processes. So these are the executive orders that we follow for environmental justice. And this is how environmental justice is defined. And so environmental justice is defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, regarding the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Which is a long-winded way of saying do your job well. And it's not something that is really amenable to some kind of step-by-step process for a planner who is addressing this. So our policy states that if adverse effects of programs and services are identified, NRCS will take steps, including avoidance, minimization, or mitigation of those impacts to the greatest extent possible. Environmental justice is more than just planning. It's about awareness and providing training to our employees. It's why the Civil Rights Committee goes around to the field office every other year doing the quality reviews. They ask questions about your county. They ask, how do you know the ethnic makeup of your county? What kind of outreach activities you're doing in your county? These are all part of environmental justice. It's why we do diversity days. It's why we do outreach and try to improve access to USD information and resources for everybody, all the taxpayers. So NRCS ensures that citizens in historically underserved, that's great, underserved communities have access to its financial and technical programs and services. This is doing outreach. So you're just trying to ensure that you do your job properly, you do your planning, not according to whatever, well, I'm not even going to go there. You're doing your planning as a planner. and you're reaching out to people within your county, and you're reaching out to people that don't normally contact you within your county. This is all part of environmental justice. And as part of the planning process, if you are concerned about the practices you're applying, or you want to know more about what's going on within your county, there is a wide suite of information sources that you can access. I mean, one that I found recently, which is really pretty effective, is called EJ Screen. It's EPA's environmental justice screening and mapping tool, and you can reach it by clicking the link on the page. And you can point and select by longitude. You can select the census block. You can select the various amount of areas in your county. And then it will give you an enormous amount of information on age, language, minority status, low income, education status, and really all the information that you need within your county to more, properly do your job as a planner. And so really, I don't want to emphasize any kind of set planning steps for environmental justice, because it's the overall awareness and training that we have and the outreach we do as a federal agency. So I'll finish with prime and unique farmland. So NRCS is concerned about any action that tends to impair the productive capacity of American agriculture. So the nation needs to know the extent and location of the best land for producing the stereotypical food, feed, fiber, forage, and oilseed crops. So prime farmland is land that has the best combination of physical and chemical characteristics for producing the aforementioned food, feed, forage, fiber, and oilseed. Unique farmland is the one that we apply to the less common crops such as citrus, tree nuts, olives, cranberries, fruits, and vegetables. And state and locally important farmlands, there are states that have them. I haven't found any that are listed for Indiana. So the protection of prime farmlands derives out of the Farmland Protection and Policy Act, which instructs us to minimize the extent with federal programs contribute to the unnecessary and irreversible conversion of farmland to non-agricultural use. So all NRCS activities, including CTA, are federal programs, and these activities must comply with the Farmland Protection Policy Act. So there are two classes of exemptions to FPPA. There's land that's not considered farmland for purposes of the Act, which are committed to urban development or water storage. And activities exempt from provisions of the FPPA include the construction of farm structures necessary for farm operations. So building barns, manure storage lagoons, etc., are allowable on prime and unique farmlands. But as for NRCS, you should always be advising the client not to build the farm buildings on primary and unique farmlands. So fortunately, virtually all activities undertaken by NRCS are exempt from the Farmland Protection Act for two reasons. They do not result in the irreversible conversion of farmland, and they all fall under that agricultural use exemption. So even though an action may be exempt in that sense of building a barn or a storage lagoon, NRCS should always consider the feasibility of locating the structures on non-prime farmland. So the location of prime and unique farmland in Indiana, you can find it in the Web Soil Survey. You can find it in any GIS layer of soil maps. And actually, it's funny, I don't know whether or not that is also on CD, though Jennifer is on this, so she could probably answer me that if that layer exists on the conservation desktop. So in the CPA 52, there is no prime and unique farmland present, and you make it not applicable, or you have prime and unique farmland, but there's no effect and no conversion proposed. All right. So any questions before we go on to categorical exclusions? Okay, Brianne?
All right. We are in the home stretch. So now we're going to dive back into the CPA 52 form and the final part of these presentations. We will be taking the information from all of the special environmental concerns we have considered, as well as what we know about the alternatives we are considering, and determining their significance in terms of the impact on the environment. First, we should look at whether the action can be categorically excluded from a detailed review under NEPA, and those detailed reviews would be an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. A categorical exclusion is a category of actions that NRCS has demonstrated do not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect on the environment. We touched on these briefly in our first session 2 weeks ago. If an action is listed as being able to be categorically excluded, NRCS must still determine whether there are extraordinary circumstances that preclude the applicability of the categorical exclusion. And since NRCS adopted significance criteria as its criteria for extraordinary circumstances, the criteria is used to determine if a categorical exclusion can be used. And so if we can't categorically exclude it, and we're going to go through a series of slides kind of going over these exclusions, then we're going to need either an environmental assessment or an EIS statement. As a reminder, all of the guidance related to the CPA 52 is found on SharePoint. It's under directives and the technology. There are some additional screenshots of how to quickly access it. On the home page near the top, there is a quick reference to the CPA 52 and takes you to its folder and the guidance that came with it. And within there are all the attachments as well as the bulletin itself from 1/80/2006. And we have, as mentioned in the prior presentation 2 weeks ago, there is a webinar that goes into much more detail on the CPA 52 in these, but we're just going to hit upon the categorical exclusions today. So Indiana guidance for the categorical exclusions are that they are for programs where NRCS is the responsible federal official. So keep in mind that categorical exclusions do not apply for CRP plans. Categorical exclusions should always be the first choice for any federal action in Section Q of the 52. So is a federal action, all of which is categorically excluded from further environmental analysis, and there are no extraordinary circumstances in Section P. So we need these to be categorically excluded. Document the applicable categorical exclusions in the drop-down list in Section R2 of the 52. R1 is left blank when a categorical exclusion applies. R2 has 3 rows. 2 can be used for the applicable exclusions, and the 3rd is reserved for the sideboards. There are 21 potential categorical exclusions, but 5 are the most applicable to the majority of our conservation plans. Categorical exclusion 1, planting appropriate herbaceous woody vegetation. Number 11, restoring an ecosystem, fish and wildlife habitat, biotic community, or population of living resources to a determinable pre-impact condition. Number 19, undertaking minor agricultural practices to maintain and restore ecological conditions in floodplains after a natural disaster or on lands impacted by human alteration. Exclusion 20, implementing soil control measures on existing agricultural lands, and 21, implementing water conservation activities on existing agricultural lands, such as irrigation practices. So you can see these 5 really encompass a large portion of what we do on a daily basis. This document was issued as an attachment with the CPA 52 guidance bulletin last year and goes into more detail on the categorical exclusions and how to make those decisions. In addition, this table is available and embedded within the 52 itself. If you scroll the bottom of the Excel document to the furthest worksheet to the left, you will find this table. It shows our conservation practices and indicates which of the categorical exclusions apply to those practices. It also includes a color coding for those CEs that apply to practices in a particular program. Again, you also need to use your knowledge as a planner to ensure that these categorical exclusions do apply in a particular instance. And this is where the sideboards come into effect. To be legally applicable, a categorical exclusion must meet 6 overarching criteria. These are the sideboards, and these must be documented in row 3 of section R2 of the CPA 52. The full list of sideboards A through F are listed in the 52 by hovering your mouse over the first column of section R2 and include A, be designed to mitigate soil erosion, sedimentation, and downstream flooding. B, require disturbed areas to be vegetated or with adapted species that are neither invasive nor noxious. C, be based on current federal principles of natural stream dynamics and processes such as those presented in the Federal Interagency Stream Corridor Restoration Working Group document. That's a mouthful. Stream Corridor Restoration Principles, Processes, and Practices. This includes that altering of streams and is often the sideboard that is not applicable in many instances. Incorporate the applicable Nrcs conservation practice standards as found in the Field Office Technical Guide. This is a key one. Not require substantial dredging, excavation, or placement of fill, and not involve a significant risk of exposure to toxic or hazardous substances. So again, you need to meet all of these unless it is blatantly not applicable. As I said, C is often the one that will be listed as not applicable, and you need to document that it is not applicable. You will say that it meets the sideboards other than, and then list them accordingly. There is standard language in the CPA 52 section R2 row 3 for those sideboards. Practices in the preferred alternative meet sideboards. Enter the letters there. All other sideboard criteria do not apply. Sideboards can be listed by their letters, such as A, B, D, E, and F. All other sideboard criteria do not apply, but it is critical to have the form completed with this information. An example, 612 tree and shrub establishment, the process of establishing mass-producing trees to provide food and cover for wildlife. Practices in the preferred alternative meet sideboards A, to be designed to mitigate soil erosion, sediment, and downstream flooding. B, require disturbed areas to be vegetated to adapted species. D, do not require substantial dredging and excavation. E, to incorporate an applicable conservation practice. And F, do not involve a significant risk of exposure to toxic substances. All other sideboard criteria do not apply. You do not need to include what's in parentheses. These are on here just as an example of how these sideboards apply to a particular practice. There are many of the categorical exclusions which are more relevant to specific programs such as WRE, the Emergency Watershed Program, or the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program, PL 566. Some of them are listed here. It just depends on the practices, though, that are implemented as part of those programs. One thing to keep in mind as you're considering categorical exclusions is that we must look at the entire conservation plan. We cannot separate out different practices, one that may meet the sideboards and others that do not, or that one that does not meet any categorical exclusion versus those that do not. We must take into consideration the entire plan, and the entire plan must meet all the categorical exclusions to be considered a valid consideration under the environmental evaluation. So we're really looking at everything, not piecing it out, trying to get different practices in through different ways as we go through the process. And if through that assessment of all the alternatives and all the practices that are part of the entire plan, you are unable to categorically exclude an action or actions, then it's time to seek out other alternatives. And if there are no other alternatives, it's time to elevate the project through the chain of the of command. And why is that? Because once we leave this option of categorical exclusions, it now becomes a potential environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. And these have occurred in the agency, typically as it relates to the PL 566 or maybe other dam projects and things like that that have happened historically, but it is not typically a route that we are going to take or even want to take for an individual conservation plan on an individual field. So we are really, really emphasizing that using practices and practices that are within the sideboards that we discussed earlier that can be categorically excluded. This is why as well, if you are involved with WRE and involved with the compatible use process, we really emphasize the use of various practices in that compatible use process, whether it's trails or food plots under the 645, because again, that really links this back to practices that have been evaluated at a national level and can then be categorically excluded if they meet those sideboards, one of which has to be a practice in our field office technical guide. So again, we're really using those as the driving factor behind a lot of what goes on in the CPA 52, and everything that we've talked about in the last 3 weeks in terms of special environmental concerns become those driving factors that look at the overall impact of the practices and making sure that there's nothing significant that would prohibit them from being categorically excluded. And with that, that wraps up our series. Again, there are 3 weeks. If you have not been able to meet all of or join us for the live version of the webinar, they are all recorded. Each of the various environmental evaluation series webinars are listed here. Again, there were 11 of them. We covered them in 3 weeks rather than 11 weeks. You are certainly, if you are interested in more information on any of these topics, able to go to the Environmental Evaluation and Compliance webpage for NRCS. They are listed there, and you can watch the complete webinar with more details onto each of these different topics. If you have missed any of the webinar recordings, you're welcome to go back and watch the recording and just make sure you document that with your local planning staff so that you get credit for these trainings. With that, some final questions?
It appears we have beaten them into submission.
We appreciate everyone hanging in there for 3 weeks through some very heavy policy. And Shannon, I think we can probably stop recording.